We're on.
We're on.
We're on. Right, students.
Welcome back.
Welcome back again. We're smashing it out today. Current policy mix, Mr. Smithers. So, straight from the study design, the relationship between aggregate supply side policies and macroeconomic demand management policies in the current government policy mix. We've covered this in class, but it is important. There's often a question about the policy mix in exams. So, as Mr. Smithers is writing here, when we talk about macro demand management policies, monetary and budgetary policy or fiscal policy. Punch on. So, let's talk quickly a little bit about aggregate supply. One of the first things, students, you need to understand is that aggregate supply is a long-run prospect or a long-run phenomena. And I was disappointed in the last SAC. Not many students, I marked this question, not many students could accurately draw an aggregate supply curve. And one of the things you really do need to pick up on is the fact that it does become inelastic. That at this point here, we are seeing the curve turn vertical. And the reason for that is clearly we're approaching full employment or at our productive capacity. And then if you go forward, you'll see that we have a situation, we put our aggregate demand curve in, and notice I've put here short run aggregate demand curve, because this is one of the things you need to understand. The macro demand management policies in the policy mix are short run policies predominantly to try and stimulate demand. Aggregate supply side policies are an attempt to improve the supply side over the long run. And you can see an example here of our demand management policies. If we're at AD, well and down in this point here, sorry, I'll go back, at AD1 here, we'd use expansionary fiscal policy in theory or a loosening of monetary policy to shift our aggregate demand curve out to the right to try and improve growth, GDP on this axis, and the general price level or inflation might go up a little bit but would still be within the target as we approach full employment. Anything to add there, Mr. Smithers?
Yeah, so it's really important once we get to this point here that we start thinking about these long-run policies that Mr. Burns talked about, and we try and push aggregate supply side out so that growth is sustainable, and sustainable in terms of inflation, so that we can grow while keeping inflation at the target rate between 2 and 3%. So to show what we're talking about in relation to a favourable movement, we have our same graph and we move out there with the orange line. So this is can be complementary with aggregate demand side policy. So if we have policy such as
increase in immigration, is that?
Yeah, increase in immigration will increase aggregate supply. It will also have an impact on aggregate demand. But it needs to, the aggregate supply curve needs to grow, and I've said this to my class a bit, in concert with the aggregate demand curve, because of course the aggregate demand curve will drive economic growth, and we want economic growth at between 3 and 4%, but it can't happen without this movement in aggregate supply.
Not when you're at full capacity.
Certainly not.
So you can see the supply side, I'm getting ahead of myself, a favourable movement supply side. Without the aggregate demand curve in there, prices will fall. And that's not a bad thing. If we're at full capacity and we've got some inflationary pressures, we might see, if we're at this point here, we want to get higher rates of growth, increase. Sometimes the Reserve Bank talks about the speed limit of the Australian economy. We need a supply side curve. And that's what this would be. As opposed to the previous diagram, you saw a shift in the aggregate demand curve, which would be a demand side policy to try and promote economic growth. This is a supply side policy, and as you can see here, as the aggregate supply policy, so let's say it's an increase in immigration, and we take more skilled migrants, this adds to our labour resources, increases our capacity to make more goods and services, adds to our supply side resources, and we get higher levels of growth as GDP increases. So you do need to be able to grapple with the aggregate supply and demand curves. You're probably not going to be asked to draw them in an exam, but it doesn't hurt to be able to draw them, and then obviously you refer to them in your answer as a way to explain a question. Examiners certainly do reward that ability to do that.
So don't be frightened to draw the curves. If you're confident on drawing those graphs, as Mr. Burns said, the examiners will appreciate it, and you can refer in your answer to the graph that you have drawn.
It's really important you do refer. Don't just draw it and leave it sitting there without any context. Okay. So what are our supply side policies? Well, it's a government initiative designed to lower the costs improve supply conditions, increase productivity. We've covered 4 in class, and the aim of them, as I said, is to improve productive capacity, lead to higher living standards, and as we've just said, it'll move the curve out to the right. The 4 key policy areas we've covered, and this is where the current policy mix needs to be discussed. So clearly, budgetary policy. Now this confuses students, because a lot of students say, well, hang on, budgetary policy is a demand management policy. Well, yes, it is. But some specific initiatives within the budget, and this is one of the strengths of the budget, allows it to target supply side issues, if you like, or to allow it to increase the supply side of the economy. For example, the accelerated depreciation allowance in the recent budget has allowed us to, or encourages businesses to increase their capital expenditure on goods, bring it forward perhaps, and there's some debate about they're just dragging expenditure forward into one quarter from the next, but that's a different comment. But the idea is that they should be encouraged to purchase new capital goods. This adds to the capital stock in the economy, increases their productivity because they're using better and more equipment, so multi-factor productivity goes up and their output increases and supply side expands. So that's an example of budgetary policy, supply side budgetary policy.
And the other one that my class know well is the Northern Australia infrastructure projects that have been allowed for in this most recent budget, and how we've discussed that infrastructure is a really good supply side policy to talk about in terms of increasing aggregate supply and hopefully increasing exports and competitive nature of our manufacturers and producers in Australia, particularly in areas of agriculture, which is related to the next dot point, which brings the FTAs into account.
Well, that's right. So in microeconomic reform, each student in the state of Victoria gets to choose one microeconomic reform that they're expected to know reasonably well. We chose trade liberalisation, and within that, as well as understanding what trade lib is, a move towards freer trade, and removal of tariffs and quotas and opening up of markets, we focused predominantly upon free trade agreements, and we looked in depth at both Japan and China. And you do need to know the free trade agreements, the what's in them, some specific things about them, but more importantly, or as importantly, you need to be able to explain how, for example, the CHAFTA is a supply side policy. How does it add to our capacity to supply goods and services, and how does it add to our productive output? And the argument clearly is that we've got not as open up markets, but it also allows us to import goods at a cheaper rate, so import more capital goods, but it also allows us to export more goods into the external market, into the, for example, the Chinese agricultural market. There were some significant concessions, or significant concessions in dairy have been gained, along with a lot of other agricultural goods, and that's a really significant boost to our economy.
So have some industry examples with regards to the free trade agreements. Don't just talk very generally about them. Give a really specific example, and those agricultural ones that Mr. Burns just touched on, I think are really good. I mean, the beef industry and the dairy industry are two that have gained greatly from both those free trade agreements that we referred to. Japan,
aquaculture as well in Japan has opened up a lot of the seafood market in Japan's also been opened up, and we've seen, the trade-off is that we've seen lower prices for imported goods in terms of electronics from both those markets and if you like, some of the manufactured goods. I'm getting the wind up here from Mr. Smithers. Immigration policies, as you know, increases labour resources. We've touched upon that as well. Environmental policies is one supply side policy is worth spending a couple of seconds on, if that's okay with you, boss.
Yes.
Really, one of the arguments here is, does environmental policy increase supply? Well, really, you need to be sophisticated in your response. My argument, and my class, we've certainly talked about how environmental policies are part of the global coalition to reduce the impact in the long run of supply side shocks or adverse weather events, droughts, floods, those sort of things, bushfires, etc. And the point is that, yes, of itself, Australia can't solve climate change, but we should and are expected to be part of a global coalition to reduce carbon emissions, to keep the increase in the global temperature to below 2 degrees, which reduces the severity and impact of these adverse weather effects. And that's stopping these supply side shocks. And as Mr. Smith is writing down there, a key point in environmental policy to discuss is the concept of intertemporal efficiency. And you need to really be aware of that.
Okay. So that's
current policy mix supply side.
So how's it work with the macroeconomic demand policies? Remember, we're talking about fiscal and monetary here. So of course, what you know about your macro is that basically they worked in a counter-cyclical manner. So we go into a deficit when we're in a downturn. We should be going to a surplus when we're in an upswing. Same, we have accommodative monetary policy in a downturn, and we have tighter monetary policy when we're in an upswing. And you only need to look back to the pre-GFC, straight down, and these macro policies worked beautifully in terms of the theory in that period of time between 2006 and then 2010 perhaps, is a lovely sort of illustration of how they are meant to work.
Interestingly enough, though, will Janet Yellen increase interest rates this week, Mr. Smithers? In America, they're looking at the counter-cyclical side of things. They're looking at the other way from Australia. We've got very loose and accommodative monetary policy and talking about lowering interest rates in the future. America's on the other side, looking at starting to raise them.
I'm going to say no.
You're going to say no?
But that's personal interest driving that.
I'm going to say yes, purely objective opinion here.
Yes. All right. So, obviously, we're trying to smooth out the business cycle and wild fluctuations with our budgetary and monetary policy.
Now, I've put in theory here because this is one of the areas where we can discuss the conflict, I guess, currently within our macro demand management policies. It's not a massive conflict, but it is a conflict. That fiscal policy is currently looking at a mildly contractionary stance. The deficit is coming in, I think, 35 from around 40. I put it in somewhere, might be later on. I mentioned the short run stuff, but the point is that monetary policy is exceptionally loose, whereas fiscal policy, some people argue it's neutral, but we've agreed that it's mildly contractionary. And you can, most economists, even the Reserve Bank, has come out and said public demand is flat, and that is a drag on growth. And
that's political factors driving that. Of course, we've been a lot of pressure on all governments since this wild spending, not wild, but the increase in spending as a result of the GFC. All governments have had a lot of pressure on them and have promised surplus budgets. And now they're struggling to deliver that because we've had, as you know, below average or below trend growth.
But it's a bit of a... anyway, it's a theoretical debate you can have, but it's also a practical outcome.
And it's a weakness of fiscal policy, is the political constraints within that.
But going back to my point about monetary policy being very loose, I'm not going to harp on this, we've done this before, but as you can see, clearly accommodative stance or loosening of monetary policy, very, very lowest levels. And this is historically, as you can see in this period of time, we haven't seen interest rates below this point before. So, fiscal policy, 35 billion, there it is, I knew I had it somewhere, to 41 billion. So it's a mildly contractionary fiscal policy stance is what Mr. Smith has alluded to. So if you're talking about the current policy mix, it would be appropriate, or it would be expected that you would be able to evaluate why this is contractionary, and whereas monetary policy is incredibly expansionary. And that's where you talk about the debate about debt and deficit, as Mr. Smith has said, the global factors trying to reduce the budget's deficit, the considerations about some of the structural issues in the budget, their concern about expenditure growing because of the ageing population, their concern about shrinking tax base, and they're trying to put the budget back onto an even footing, the fiscal balance argument that we have discussed. But in the short run, there is a strong case to say it should be more stimulatory. Australia does not have a significant debt in terms of government debt, and we are in a situation where growth, as you all know, has slowed to well below our long-run average. Having said that, there are some decisions in the budget, if you do get asked a specific question about discretionary budgetary policy, that you could argue were stimulatory. And the small business tax cut is one, certainly the accelerated depreciation allowance for small businesses is another one.
Yeah.
Comment?
No, nothing else. I mean, there wasn't a hell of a lot in this budget due to the fact that the budget last year was so controversial, and some elements of that still haven't got through the Senate. So they've played a very safe budget, and hence they're not trying to reduce that deficit by as much as they might have been otherwise. So, and as Mr. Burns said, there is an argument here at this time that budget deficit could even blow out.
No, it will blow out.
All right. So, in summary, the policy mix refers to how these policies work together to achieve different goals. So we've got our 5 goals, and you need to be able to discuss how they work together to achieve those goals. So you need to be able to take something out of each of the policies and relate it back to whether it's external stability, inflation, or each of the particular goals.
But often you may also get asked, probably in these sort of questions, you'd talk a little bit about eco growth, is really what they're talking about in the current policy mix. They might talk about to achieve economic growth and full employment. They'll probably link the goals of economic growth and equity are the more common answers. And one of the key things I think what examiners are looking for is current knowledge, GDP's growth, what GDP figures are quite low, what's the cause of that. And we haven't seen a lot of supply side reform in the last sort of 4 or 5 years due to a number of factors. A bit of reform fatigue has crept into both Australia and the political groupings, I guess, but it's really about the fact that we've had this political debate about getting reform through. Reform's hard, people don't like reform, structural unemployment, those sort of things create it and make it difficult for governments to get reform through. So the focus of supply side policies has been on the FTAs, and we do have a fairly strong immigration policy still, skilled immigration.
Yeah, and I think, interestingly enough here, I will bring in the political machinations of the change of leader from Abbott to Turnbull. The way that Turnbull's already been speaking about innovation, he's been talking about gaining competitive advantage in certain industries where we have an advantage. This, immediately I started thinking about the aggregate supply side moving out to the right through possible government policies that might push
Did you really?
Innovation. I did when he made his speech the other night, and I thought that here's an opportunity. He might be picking particular industry winners to try and drive some of that increase in aggregate supply, because it seemed like he had some very firm ideas that we needed to increase the level of innovation. Now, whether this just comes in the form of government grants or whether it's something a little more sophisticated, and possibly we might get a more sophisticated debate on tax reform. And
We've
tax
already
reform,
talked about taking the GST increase. Frydenberg was in the news last night talking about taking a GST increase to the next election.
So that tax comes under your budgetary policy. There's a bit that in the study design that talks about infrastructure and taxation reform. So a more efficient tax system may be something that can increase the level of aggregate supply without actually hurting growth. So there's a bit to think about, and this is often an area where the examiners allow you to say what could occur. So even policies that are just being discussed in the media have the ability for you to elaborate on them as what could occur.
Often they'll talk about an initiative that has been announced or considered or something like that in the question. The other thing in this area is the questions are sometimes talk about evaluate the extent to which the policies have supported each other. So this is the evaluate concept allows you to come and say, well, no, they haven't worked well, or yes, they have, or they could be doing more. It's a sophisticated response that requires you to go through and analyse the policy mix in its current format and then make some sort of judgment or evaluation of how well the government's done in managing to achieve the various goals that they may have mentioned.
Yeah, and they'll probably ask you to evaluate the extent it's supported economic growth. Now, this is where you must have a knowledge of the fact that economic growth at the moment is fairly weak. And so your evaluation should come out and say, well, they haven't been successful.
Exactly.
Because if you come out and say, oh, they've been really successful with 2% interest rates in driving economic growth, you'll sound like a little bit of a doofus because economic growth is below trend, it's struggling, therefore that's where your answer should head, and that's why it's so important to have that knowledge of current unemployment rates, current economic growth rates,
unemployment's
and the
gone
inflation
up.
rate.
Inflation's low, so that's one you could say, well, they've done okay in inflation, but that's really a byproduct of the fact there's no growth in the economy. So it's really about growth being weak, unemployment trending upwards. Those sort of factors are some of the key issues, and how do they work to support those things? You'd come in and say they haven't really, monetary policy's having a crack. It's going hard. It's very expansionary. Fiscal policy hasn't been pulling its weight to some extent because of a variety of factors. Supply side, well, they're long-run policies, so we haven't seen the immediate effect of them, and they've been limited to FTAs, which will have an effect, a positive effect in the future through comparative advantage and free trade, but they're still to have an impact. and they're because of their long run nature. So the evaluation is, well, they're not doing as well as perhaps we would have expected them to be.
So a really good practice for you guys to do in the holidays would be to actually do this question and focus on, you know, how well they've worked together to achieve economic growth over the last 2 years, and have a crack at that for 8 marks. And we'd be very interested to see what you come up with.
All right, all good.
All good. Have a great holiday. Except it's not a holiday for you guys. It's a study break.
It's a non-instructional period.
Non-instructional period.
Non-instructional period. Don't forget, students, if you need, I'll be around in the holidays for email contact. If you want to give, if you've got any questions or you want to send something through, by all means, give me an email. Mr. Smithers is off sunning himself, so he won't be as contactable as I am. But both classes are very welcome to make email contact with
California.
if they need. Good luck with your economics study. Keep it coming, and remember, pay attention to the news. I mean, you will because it's good stuff.
That's right. It's always